Before we dive in today, I want to let you know a few ways you can support the podcast. The biggest one by far is word of mouth. If you enjoy this and you know other Stephen King fans, please tell them about it. Share the episodes on social media. It really does help. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Sematary. There are links to those in the show notes. And if you are really dedicated to the show, you can become a Patreon supporter where I will have bonus episodes going up. I am covering all of the Stephen King related comics over on Patreon, so there's definitely going to be a lot more bonus content coming this year. And now let's get into the episode. Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Jenn Adams from the Losers Club. Jenn, welcome to the show. Do you want to introduce yourself for our listeners since it is your first time here?
Sure, I would love to. Hi, I'm Jenn Adams. I'm so excited to be here and talk about one of my favorite King books. And I am a co-host of the Losers Club podcast and the Psychoanalysis podcast, and just love this book and love Stephen King. So excited.
I'm very excited to have you, and we're talking all about 11/22/63 today. I am stoked to be in the 2010s finally.
Right, yeah. Gosh, think about how long of a journey that is, like how many books.
Yeah, and I have recently started doing the comics over on my Patreon, so it's like all of the 2010 stuff is just hitting in stride right now for me. And luckily, I absolutely loved 11/22/63, and I feel like having seen the show prior to reading it, it kind of, had me reading some of the voices as the actors' voices in my head. And, I did the same thing with Fight Club. I had seen the movie first, and then I was just like reading the book as Brad Pitt and Edward Norton in my head.
Yeah. Yeah, I do that too. And I had read the book before I saw it was Hulu, right?
Yeah.
The Hulu show. So I actually kind of had some I did not ever see James Franco as Jake/George. So that was a little bit I joke that it felt like the Yellow Card Man sometimes, trying to keep it straight in my head. But yeah, I love this book so much. This is in my top 5 of Stephen King books, which probably I guess would make it in my top 5 of all time books. And I did like the show. I thought the show was good. I didn't like it nearly as much as the book though. But I mean, that's a very high bar.
Yeah. Before we dive in here, though, is this a book you've read numerous times? Because my paperback copy is over 1,000 pages, so it's a lengthy one. I don't know how often I'll find myself rereading some of the longer books, especially something like Under the Dome. But this one, it flew by, and it was my first time reading it. But for you, what is your experience with this book?
I think I got it probably either right after it came out or the birthday after it came out, and I can't remember what the year that was. Was it 2011 maybe?
Yeah.
And so I got it then, and I was really not excited to read it because I thought it was going to be really heavy historical story, and I was I just don't know if I'm interested in this. And then I was on my first maternity leave, and I just kind of I wasn't bored, but I was looking for something to do that didn't have to do with babies, and so I just picked it up and just loved it and flew through it. And it's I have these memories of holding my daughter and reading this book and, being excited to read it, being super tired, but wanting to finish the chapter. And so that was the first time. And then I think this is my 4th time reading it because I got the audiobook and have listened to that a couple of times. I've said before, before I discovered podcasts, I would just listen to Stephen King audiobooks over and over again. And this was one that was in my rotation. And so when it's an audiobook, I don't mind how long it is sometimes, I love listening to the Stand audiobook and Needful Things. But I will say this is one of, Needful Things. And this one were the 2 I skipped when I went through my chronological reread because I had just read it pretty recently, and I was this is an emotional journey. I don't know if I'm ready for it right now. So it had been a couple of years since I've read it. I was really happy to revisit it.
As many people know, Stephen King loves to write about what he knows, and I know that before he really caught his break, he was teaching. So this is kind of a different look at something King has done, because a lot of times we'll see him write about writers, and yes, technically George is writing a book, but not really. So, it's a little different. But I think he said this idea first came to him in like 1971, and the book doesn't come out until 40 years later, which is crazy. But then you can kind of understand where some of this perspective was coming from too, because that's not too terribly long after 1963.
Right. Yeah. And it kind of fits into like his worldview too. And I wonder what it would be like if he had written it back then or finished it back then. Cause I kind of have this suspicion that he maybe wrote parts of it, you know, and then kind of played around with it for a while. Cause he's also talked about The Stand, like having these ideas and just not really knowing where to go with them. And then it like clicks, you know, especially with this one because of how historical it was and how like much research he would have to do. But it's interesting. Like, I'm glad that he waited as long as he did to write it, because I think, one, the future wouldn't have been that distant, you know, like we wouldn't get the parts where he's telling Sadie about who the president is if he had written it when he actually had the idea, you know.
Yeah, it was probably, sort of this bare bones idea. And I don't think he's necessarily one who outlines a ton. I think he just kind of sits down and just goes with whatever comes to him. But he could have fairly easily had some sort of idea down, like 10, 15, 20 pages or something like that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the beginning of the book. And, like you said, having that element of the present day being something that we've lived through and not something so close to the actual date of Kennedy's assassination makes a lot more sense, because one, it's a much more drastic change for your character. And two, you have those little elements added like, oh crap, I forgot to get rid of my cell phone.
Right, exactly. Which I was reading that this time and I was like, come on, Al didn't remind him to do that when he was actually going back to not just like play around, you know? But I guess that's like, I did enjoy that part, and the following the thread of what if somebody found this nickel that said 2002. You know? Like that's fun,
because that's something you don't think about too.
Exactly. Yeah, like that's one of the. I love this book, and I'm not a huge sci-fi fan. Or like time travel, it's just not really a genre that really grabs me. But what I love about this book is how many of those like fun details and like heart and relatable stuff there is, you know, like I think it's like he gets busted because he's singing Witchy Woman or something, you know, and it's just like these fun little nods that I think make the story like really ground the story for as like kind of theoretical as it can get at times, you know?
And it's just those little things that people are kind of like, huh? And he says something like having a senior moment to someone. And they're like, that's a funny way to put it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and it's weird because he, like, I think he's very good at writing pop culture in times where I feel like he is participating in pop culture, you know? And the older he gets, his references don't always hold up for me, you know, like I'm thinking of like The Institute, a couple of things in there, but this is like it fits here because like he's not in the present for that long, and there's this whole kind of like Jake kind of feels like a fish out of water in both worlds, you know, so it's like that makes it like the character a little more endearing, you know.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think made this even more interesting is that the portal takes Jake to 1958. So he has to live for, 5+ years to get to his end goal. And it allows you to spend way more time with the character and getting to know not only who he is in the present day, but who he's trying to be in this entirely new time period to him. Because it's not even like he was a young kid during this time period and would have memories of it. It's from before he was born. And I think that's key too, to having it so spaced out.
Yeah. Yeah, he's never been a part of this culture in another way, you know. And that's like the what you were saying about the part of the show that was left out. Like those are my favorite parts of the book, and that's what like I would argue the book is actually about, like enjoying life rather than like a time period. And I mean a love story too, because I do think this is his best love story. But it's like those are the things I love. I love the play. I love like the pies and the dancing. And I wish we got more of him being a teacher, because I think this is one of the few, like you mentioned that he's a teacher here. And I feel like most of the time when King writes teachers, he writes teachers who want to be writers, you know? And I love the moment where Jake says, or George, I guess, he says, you know, I would like to write a book, but what I'm finding I really love is teaching. And I feel like that's kind of the reverse of a lot of the characters that we normally get. Like I'm trying to think of other teacher writers that he's written about where they really, really love teaching, you know? And that, like it always, Jack always comes to mind from The Shining, who doesn't like teaching. He wants to be a writer, but this is paying his bills, you know? And I love that we see the other side, because it's like that connection with his students that I just love. And like being a former teacher, like there's like a nostalgia there for me too. It's like, the good moments of teaching are just like, you can't describe them, you know?
Yeah, and I agree that I would have loved to see a little more of that. We do get a little bit of it when he's in Jody, but you know, before we get to his time in Texas, I don't remember anything about Derry really being a big part of the show, because if I'm not mistaken, the show was only 8 episodes, and I think it really wanted to focus on the assassination part of the story, and rightfully so. You know, that's the title of the book. You have this big historical event. But when you get those moments with Richie and Beverly.
Oh, gosh. I love that moment. Yes.
It's just so good. And then you have them dancing, and it's like you see this innocence in them that you don't quite get in the same way when you read it.
Yeah. Well, and they're not being threatened too, you know? It's like these characters that we love, like they're just being happy, you know? And that's really a nice thing to see. And I think it's interesting that those are the only 2 of the Losers Club that he wrote about. And I think Beverly was always my favorite because I just love her. But Richie, I think Richie was kind of in my top maybe 2 or 3. And this book, I think, pushed him over the top. You know, it just made me really love that character and just really happy to see them doing well. You know, it was really sweet.
You also get a good look at what Derry is like, because the events with Pennywise have definitely already happened before, but you're kind of just seeing what the other people in this town is like, because it focuses so much on the Losers Club and Pennywise, and, you know, everyone else in the town is kind of just existing, but they aren't really doing a whole lot in that story in particular. And obviously that makes sense. I'm not faulting him for that in it by any means, but I love
it's already 1,000 pages too. So.
Yeah, I love that he keeps adding to these places, you know, and we saw that happen with Castle Rock when they did the Hulu show that is just based on, you know, the town, and it takes stuff from the source material but builds it out more. And, you know, I know a lot of people really want adaptations to stick closely to the source material, but I thought that's what made Castle Rock really interesting. And that's what made Derry really interesting in the context of this book.
Yeah, building the world out. And I really liked the first season of Castle Rock. I've only seen a little bit of the second season. But yeah, it's fun to play around with the characters and the settings that we know, you know. And I'm, again, I'm also not one to really be a stickler too much about being faithful to adaptations. But I do think you need to do it well. If you're going to deviate, you need to make sure you know what you're doing and make sure you like don't fundamentally change the feeling of the book and the characters. And I don't think 11/22/63 did. I think it just cut a lot of what I loved about the book, and that's what I was missing. But the part in Derry that I loved, and I think my favorite episode of the miniseries was the part with George. Who's the dad? Dunning, Frank Dunning. The
think
terrible
so. Harry's dad.
Yes, yeah. That episode was terrifying. And I think that was a really well done episode. And really, it was different, but it like got across how hard that section of the book was to read too. Because that's the first time I cry in the book.
You really can tell that Jake has this passion for even his GED students, because that's how this whole thing with the Dunning family comes about. He has this GED student who is a janitor at the school, and his name's Harry Dunning, and he writes this essay that just hits Jake in all the feelings, and he instantly knows that if he's going to go back, this is something he's going to fix for Harry. And you see how that whole first part of the book, because if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the stuff in Derry, and really before we even get to Jody with George and Sadie's story, that's like a whole third of the book, which was why I was so surprised, because I was like, oh, wow, I think the show missed out on a lot of good opportunities here. And, you know, maybe that's something where it should have been 2 seasons, and they do like a season of the events in Derry and the events with the Dunning family, and then you have Texas, you know, Jody and Sadie, that whole storyline be its own season. But we can't change that. The show's
That's
already
true.
done.
Right, yeah. He gets to Jody and meets Sadie. That could be like the final episode. That would have been really nice. Yeah. But, you know, we can't change it. You're right.
Yeah. I just like thinking of these things, especially, you know, obviously this one already having an adaptation. You're like, okay, well, they're not going to redo this one anytime soon. But sometimes I'll be reading stuff and I'm like, you know, this is something that can use an update. And of course, it's one that's never in the works at the moment.
Right. I know. It's stuff that I'm not really that interested in. And I'm like, no, give me Mrs. Todd's Shortcut or redo something. Yeah. And I feel like this one, like the flashy story is the time travel, you know?
Yeah.
And so I understand wanting to put your money behind that and like make that the anchor of your show. I also imagine if they had skimmed on that side, people would have complained. But I mean, the heart of the story is Jake and Sadie, you know, and Jake, like Jake's arc in the book, you know, and kind of just, I don't think he really changes that much. I think he just kind of learns to love who he is, you know, because I know in the beginning, like his ex-wife, like it starts with him like talking about how his ex-wife says he's like a robot and doesn't have emotions. And then we learn how touched he was by this story and the fact that he would like give up 5 years of his life to help somebody that he doesn't even really know that well. I think, you know, speaks to like there's more to being a good person or having emotions than just crying at sometimes, you know? So I like that he kind of, I think he learns who he is and he learns what's important to him through the book, which is such a nice arc for him, you know?
Absolutely. I think a lot of that happens too, because he's going back to a time where I don't want to necessarily say things weren't complicated, because obviously, you know, politically they were, but you don't have cell phones. You can't just be connected all the time. And he actually has to, you know, work to get to know Sadie. It's not this whole thing where you can just read everything about someone on the internet, you know, on their Twitter feed or something like that. There was work that had to be put in for Jake to realize he could feel that way again. And he's able to do that by going back to this time period where that's sort of how, at least on the surface level, it seemed like everyone else felt.
Right. Yeah, my grandparents would talk about like when my grandfather was in World War II, like not hearing from him for like months, or I don't know if it was a year, but like for long periods of time. And I just think how different that is from the way we live now. And like when Sadie moves, I think it's to Las Vegas to get her divorce. Just not knowing if she's going to come back or not hearing from her, and just the amount of time. Like it's like you say in the book, it's 6 weeks, but like the day to day, the minute to minute, when you don't have constant distraction, that's just not the way our lives are anymore, you know?
Yeah. And it's so crazy to think about because, you know, not a time period either of us were around in. So we can't speak firsthand as to what these things might have been like. But you see how the 50s is portrayed in media when you have things set in that time period. And, we've heard the stories from grandparents, great aunts and uncles, what have you. And it really just felt like almost a completely different world.
Well, and that's one thing that I like that Stephen King does in this book is that I think he romanticizes the past to a certain extent, but he does mention that like it was a very racist time. Like it was really sweet and nostalgic for some people and really awful for other people. And I mean, he doesn't really dive into that a lot, but he does mention that. And I appreciate that because I think a lot of that time period, the way it's framed for us now, especially like in the 80s and 90s, was very like Norman Rockwell-esque, and like, oh, everything was great and wholesome, and yes, it was, but it was also, it was a complicated time too. It just was complicated in other ways, and it showed in other ways,
It's almost like how the 80s are like the spandex years and the 90s are like the dark grungy years when you think about the music that came out during these time periods. It really reflects the kinds of lifestyles people were living too. And I think he does a nice job too of just incorporating some of that culture with the songs and those sorts of things. And, when he's caught singing the wrong song, it's almost like that Back to the Future moment where Marty goes on stage and he just starts playing this guitar part that's totally from a different era.
I love that movie too. Yeah. And that's that fish out of water thing, which is, it's really fun. But I mean, if you think about like you said, that's 5 years of living, and I think you would go in thinking, okay, I'm not going to get close to anyone. And I think he does. Like, I'm just going to go and do and like lay low and do my thing and like read a lot, or like do all the stuff I want to have time for now that I don't have time for. But then like when you get there, like that's a long time to not connect with anybody, you know? And it would be so hard to be so guarded like that, especially when you get as close to someone as he does with Sadie.
Yeah, it's like that's 5 2020s without Zoom.
Exactly. Oh my God. Okay, I think about this because we're like 20 years from now, we are going to be telling people, oh yeah, we just worked from home for a year, or we all stayed inside and we didn't see anybody for a year. And it's going to sound like, it's like what I was saying, like the 6 weeks of time or this year of time. It just sounds like a confined thing, but like the day-to-day reality of that is... it's hard to express that or explain how that feels, and I think this book does a good job of showing like you try to find other things and you adjust and this becomes your normal and then you feel like you belong in this world instead of the other world,
Right. And you mentioning that intent, Sadie literally falls right into his lap pretty much,
Oh,
and it's one of those meet cute moments, I guess, is what people call them. I don't use these words normally, but that is definitely what this is.
Oh, yeah. It's so sweet. And I just like, if I didn't love both of them so much, like it might annoy me, but they're just so sweet and so cute because I feel like they're both like really well-developed characters,
Yeah. And the fact that Sadie is trying to get a divorce in a time period where divorce is almost unheard of. It happened, obviously, but at a much smaller rate than it does not as high of a rate as it does now.
Yeah. Yeah, that section of the book is every time, like the first time I read it, I think it didn't hit me as hard as it does now, and just, because, well, I have some things in my past that I've talked about on Losers Club, but that section, I just love it because I feel like it's a really unique look at an abusive relationship or an emotionally abusive relationship and just the level of like control and repression there that's really interesting. And I think that a lot of that is a result of the time period of like not being able to be who you are and feeling like you have to like, you have to get married. Like, this is what you do. And once you're married, you don't get divorced. This is not what you do. Like, I know at the Jamboree after Sadie gets attacked, there's the couple that didn't want to let them use the gym because they thought it was like a bad look for someone to have been attacked by her husband or her ex-husband, which is just like horrific. But that was like the thought process for a lot of people at the time, unfortunately.
And it seems like a time period where if you were having problems in your marriage, you did not let anyone know about it under any circumstances, except for maybe a close friend or two.
Exactly. Like, I mean, when she describes that relationship, like, that sounds terrible. And to think that it had to get that bad for her to try to get out of it, whereas I think maybe in a more accepting time, she would have seen a lot of red flags and felt more empowered to do something about it sooner, Also, I think maybe her first husband would not have had the same kind of issues that he did. And I'm not excusing anything he did because he is terrible, but I'm just saying, like, people like that don't exist in bubbles, and I think society a lot of times plays into that and makes like the way he is, I think makes it worse. A lot of it is just pressure and expectations, I think, combined with like mental illness and being an asshole.
And you have the fact that even though George and Sadie have this budding relationship, it wouldn't be what it is without all of these characters surrounding them, including Johnny, unfortunately. But then you have Deke, Ms. Mimi, and Miss Ellie, and those characters just bolster our main character's story so much, because it's not like there's a heavy focus on these characters in the same way that we're focusing on George and Sadie in particular, but without them, the story wouldn't be as fulfilling.
I totally agree. And I love Miss Mimi. She's probably my maybe third favorite character in the whole book. Just because that's kind of how I want to be when I'm older. But she, like, and the thing I think that's really unique about this book is there's not really a big bad guy, like Johnny is awful. And then there are the people that attack Jake and beat him up. And then there's, Frank Dunning. I think it's Frank. It's been... Yeah. They're bad guys and they are villains, but like the ultimate bad guy is time, Yeah. The way it resolves, you find out that's not even the bad guy. Like it's like our expectations. And I've got thoughts on the overall theme of the book, but like, I think that's partly why I love this book so much, is because it feels very positive, because there's not like this big foe or this big bad character that we're spending a lot of time with. We're mostly spending time with people who, well, I guess, okay, Oswald is also a bad guy.
Right.
Like we spend time with the characters that we really like, that are really mostly positive and good characters, Like I think about Larry Underwood in The Stand.
Yep.
And I love him and I love his arc, but he's a dick at the beginning of the book, And so like we have this arc with him, and I feel like Jake, he does have an arc, but he's never really a jerk, like we're not really spending significant time with people that aren't pleasant to read about,
One of the things I love too is that he blends real life events with fiction in such a way that you almost want to believe this is a real story. Obviously, time travel is not a thing we can do, but when you sit with these characters, they feel real. They don't have some supernatural ability like Charlie from Firestarter or Carrie. It's just this guy who stumbled upon this whole new life for himself in this time period, and he has this mission, but he doesn't have anything at his disposal other than future knowledge.
Right. And I think like it's kind of like Batman, only without a bunch of money, he doesn't have any superpowers, And I think that there's like this, one of the things I think King does really well is like lays out the stakes, because my argument with time travel lots of times is, well, why don't you just go back again? Or why don't you just pop back in and out? You know, and I think he really set it up so that you can't. And so that because it is 5 years in the future, and he's like, what am I going to wait 20 years to stop this other thing? Like it's set up for this mission to be this one thing. And I think there are really good reasons for why he wouldn't want to just go back in or like test things out more than he does, you know, which I appreciate. I also think like he defines time travel so lightly that it doesn't fall apart under scrutiny, you know, because there are some where like if you pull a little bit of the thread, the whole thing falls apart, you know, and you kind of just have to like shoo people away. But I like that this... it feels believable enough that I don't question it, you know?
Time travel is something that I'm not huge on either, and most of my experience with time travel in pop culture comes from DC's Legends of Tomorrow, which is an absolute treat to watch if you're a superhero fan and you just want something wacky to watch, because it has fun with it. And even though this story isn't quote unquote fun, it, like you said, doesn't define it so clearly that you're like, but wait, hold on here.
Right. Yeah. Or you have to wade through a bunch of like technical terms and like created things. Like I think he has a really, really good balance of the time travel element. And I also love the way it resolves too. Like that it's not a reset, that it's multiple strands. And I think that fits into like the ultimate king, like we call it King's Dominion on the Losers Club, like the ultimate King universe. I think that supports his like Dark Tower centric world, you know?
Yeah, it really does. And to dive into some of our real life characters, you mentioned Lee Harvey Oswald. Obviously, you have JFK and Jackie Kennedy, but you have Oswald and his wife, Marina, who it's not that she necessarily knows her husband is a bad person. She knows he's not the greatest guy in the world, but he's kind of trying, and they have their issues, which also feels out of place for the time period.
I feel really bad for Marina in this book, and I knew nothing about her before I started reading this, like didn't even know her name. So I'm not bringing any historical weight to my opinion of her, but she seems more kind of a victim of her times than I think even Sadie, you know, that like you don't have that many options other than to get married and have a man rescue you or take care of you. And I think it's like there's a level of chauvinism and misogyny that I think was probably common at the time. I also say that as a person who was not alive then. And then there's there's Oswald, who is an asshole on top of that, and a narcissist and abusive. And I think like you can see a difference between that, you know, but then again, like what do you do? You know, if like divorce, if you have to move to Reno and live there for 6 weeks and that's how you can get a divorce, you know, if you, what do you do? Like in the breathing method, I know the woman in that story, and I can't remember her name, she mentions like pretending that she's a widow because she wouldn't be able to get a job if they knew she was an unwed mother.
Right.
You know, and I think there are just so few options for women at that time that unfortunately it left a lot of women stuck with men like Lee Harvey Oswald and Johnny Clayton, you know?
And I should clarify, you know, Marina obviously did not like all of the things that Lee Harvey Oswald did, but I don't think she realized that he was going to go and try and shoot the president. When I say, you know, she didn't think he was, you know, that terrible of a person. Obviously, he was terrible to her. And we get a lot of that through the lens of George and him just sort of spying on them. And then you have another George who comes in, and it got a little confusing for a bit. I was like, could we have a different name?
Right. Yeah.
But obviously,
Yeah.
the real person, George, had to keep his real name. But, maybe King should have thought of that before having Jake take the name George Amberson.
Yeah. Okay. And every time they say, especially when I'm listening, when they say Mr. Amberson, I always think of The Matrix and Mr. Anderson, and my mind says Mr. Anderson in the back of my head. Yeah. And it's interesting. Because she does live with him, and we see that marriage through the lens of George/Jake. Like, we don't know the ins and outs. We don't I think he bugs the apartment, but we don't know every single thing that happens,
Yeah.
and we haven't seen their full courtship. So we don't really have a good idea of what Marina is really like, other than to kind of use what we understand about women at the time period as kind of to fill in some of the blanks,
Yeah, and that kind of leaves it open-ended enough for you to fill in the blanks either more terribly or just be like, okay, this seems to be their normal.
Right. And I think a lot of that depends on your lens, and how you read situations. And I'm saying you, I'm saying like people in general. Like, we all bring a certain level of bias and a certain level of like our worldview to every story we read. And just like George/Jake does, he's telling us through his lens, through his 2020 lens, Is it 2020? I think it's 2016, maybe. I can't remember. No, it'd have to be before 2016. I can't remember what year he's going back to.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure if it was just 2011, like when the book came out, or if it was a different year.
Probably 20. I mean, I guess we could probably assume 2011, but I can't remember.
Oh, yeah, it is 2011.
Ah, sweet. Man, the days and the years are running together recently.
Oh, I know what you mean.
Like, what year is it? You get to a certain age where you start to forget how old you are, And I didn't believe that would happen until it did. And I was like, no, I'll never forget that. That's weird. And then it happened to me. And it's like, okay, I see it. What day is it now?
Yeah, and this story is just really good start to finish. And as someone who has read not quite all of King's books just yet, but I've read enough of them to know that I'm going to like certain ones that start off on the right foot for me. And this was one where I was like, oh, he's going to Derry. That's way more interesting than him just popping into Texas.
Yeah. And I was so surprised at how much this book had that was not about JFK.
Yeah.
Like, when I think about this book, I think about Jake and Sadie. I don't think about the time travel,
Yeah, you think of Jake and Sadie and how big of a presence JFK was.
Yeah, and that's like, on this read, I've been thinking about that a lot, because if I think about what this book is really about, and especially like given the ending and the way the time travel thing resolves, like, I think it's really about like loving, like spending time with the people you love, and like the moments, like making the most out of what you have, because there's this big life event that he tries to change, and then he realizes that he can't. And like, there's this level of understanding that you don't have control over everything in your life. And like, yes, maybe you find this wonderful person to love, but things are going to happen outside of your control, and you just can't do anything about that. And so you have to savor the moments and like make the most out of them when you have something good. And I just really, that was the reading that I took from it this time, because he can't change. I mean, he has the opportunity to change, but to change the past and go back and just take Sadie, like he could just go back in time and wait in Jody for her to show up, and then not worry about JFK at all. But he chooses not to, because he realizes like it just isn't meant to be. And that's such a hard lesson to learn. But I think the older I get, the more I learn things like that, is like, this is just not, I would love for this to happen in my life, or for this to be a part of my life, but it's just not. And I can love the other parts of my life,
Yeah, to go back to Jake and Sadie a little more too, it's not that everything is easy for them either, because she can tell there's something that he is not telling her. And it isn't until he reveals everything. And after her accident, he stays with her, even though she thinks, she's not worthy of someone like him caring for her. And aside from, the physical relationship that they have throughout this, there's a much deeper emotional relationship that has its ups and downs. And I love that that was explored, because if it was just, Jake going back in time, using the name George, having this physical relationship with someone, and then going back, you would be like, okay, that's a thing that happened, but it wouldn't matter nearly as much to our main character.
Right. And I love that, like, the biggest hurdle they have in their relationship is like being honest with each other, and like having distance and keeping secrets and like setting boundaries. And I love I don't love it. The broomstick metaphor, I think, is a really fascinating one, of like a physical line that you are not allowed to cross with somebody that you're supposed to share everything with. And I love that Sadie brings that to the relationship. And she says, I'm never doing this again. So if because I know what it feels like to try to live with someone and never know who they really are, and for them never to want me to know who they really are, and to always have this secret. And I'm not going to do that again. And that is like, George has to do that, even under like his best of intentions, like until he finally can trust her enough to tell her. Like, he has to keep that a secret, and it's not out of malicious intent. But I love that she refuses to be in a relationship like that again. I think that's a really interesting like depiction of a recovering from an emotionally abusive relationship. Is just, she knows what that feels like, and she can see it coming up again. And she says, no, I know where this leads,
Exactly. Well, Jen, is there anything more you want to touch on before we dive a little bit more into how things end with this book? I know there's so much to cover here, and we're kind of doing it in broad strokes, because I feel like if we were to do a deep dive on this book, we could talk for like 8 hours straight about it.
Oh, right. Yeah, totally. The only other thing I want to mention, and it's just one of my favorite parts, is I love the Of Mice and Men scene when, and I mean, I have not read that book. So, but I know the story mostly because of this book, but I just love that scene. It's just so like, it's not necessary to the story, but it's like the heart of the story, And I love that we have that emotional moment, I think before Sadie even shows up, like we're talking about Sadie as like the core of this story, but I think it's really Jake, and Sadie is part of that, because he has all of these emotional moments without this love interest. And it's just such a nice moment. I just love it. And it makes me cry. It's the second time that I cry every time in this book.
It's definitely one of those books where you get so engrossed in it that you just feel like you're living with these characters.
Totally. Mm-hmm. And those are the best books, because you just don't want it to end.
They really are. And I felt that way about it as well. And I'm not huge on time jumps in stories, but with it, because of the 27-year thing, I felt like that tied it all together, having this battle with Pennywise as kids, and then 27 years later, that made it work better for me. And you care so much about these characters, because you're caring about them when they are kids, and then you're kind of getting to know them through a different lens as adults too, and you're getting it all at the same time. So with this, for us to get a little bit of Jake's life at the beginning, and then just really get to dive into who he is as a person when he goes back in time, I think that works really well. And the thing with the students, and I'm totally blanking on their names right now, but it's
Vince and Mike are the actors, I think, and then Bobby Jill, which I always kind of smile at that name.
Yeah, and Mike and Bobby are the two who are dating, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and you have that whole relationship where George had given them something, and you see that they just want to return the favor, and they do that after Sadie's accident and the jamboree, and you get a sense of community that I think isn't necessarily hard to come by these days, but it felt like this whole little community rallying together for first Bobby and then Sadie.
Yeah, and it does feel like something a little foreign from what we see now, you know? As much as I hate to say that, I just feel like, and I mean, I don't know. I've seen a lot of coming together this year in a lot of really special ways, but
that's fair.
Yeah. Just this community. And maybe it's because we're like, I'm not a part of my community right now because like I'm at home with just my family. We're not really seeing anybody, but those moments were really, really nice, you know, just to see everybody like knowing each other, everybody knowing people's names and really supporting each other. And just like, it just felt really wholesome, you know?
Yeah, it really does. And it's something that, again, King is really good at writing. And I think a lot of that comes from where he grew up. You know, he gives back a lot from what I can tell to the Maine community in general. And I know he has a house in Florida, but, you know, Florida probably doesn't need his money.
Right. Yeah, I think it's Sarasota. I think that he lives there. But yeah, I have a friend who has met him and is from Maine. And he apparently does give a lot to that community. And Tabitha, too.
Yeah.
Like, I think they own the radio station there. And I think... somebody probably knows better than I do, but I know he gives a lot of money to the library too, which is so sweet. And that is like, that's why I love Salem's Lot so much and Castle Rock. Like he just does small towns really, really well, like making them spooky or making them like really warm and like loving, you know?
Yeah. And sometimes he takes that and kind of turns it on its head like he does with Under the Dome.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, to an extent, Derry too, you know, like there's a sinister side to that too. And I love that Jody is like the antithesis of that. Like Jody is just sounds like a really nice place, you know?
I love it when towns feel like characters in the story.
And he does that so well too.
Yeah,
you know?
he really does.
And speaking of, like, Dallas has been forever tainted in my mind because of this book too. You know, every time somebody talks about going to Dallas, I'm like, oh, I think it's evil, you know?
Yeah, so to dive into the ending here, and apparently King posted an alternate ending on his website back in 2012. I did not read that, but now I want to track it down. I should have done my homework a little sooner before this episode, because then maybe I could have read that too. Have you read that?
I have not, and I don't know if I want to, because this is, I think, maybe my favorite King ending. Like, I absolutely love it. I think it's the perfect way to end this story, and it's what I think makes me love the book so much. And I had heard that he had probably that original ending, and then his son Joe Hill suggested this one, which I can believe. Like, I haven't read a ton of Joe Hill, but what I've read, I could see that given the way some of his other stuff has ended. And I just think it's perfect. And I wonder what King's ending would be, but I want this to be the only ending. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and how we get there is Jake goes back through the portal and Lisbon Falls is just in shambles completely.
Yeah. And see, and I think about that. But the ending that I always think about is Sadie, you know, and I guess that's just the part that I just love so much. But yeah, it's so interesting the way the time travel wraps up, because he's doing this like really altruistic thing, and he's really doing it to try to help. And he realizes that in doing this, what he thinks is a noble thing, he has, how many more people has he killed?
Right.
You know, and I mean, I don't know if it's fair to say it that way, but I mean, to reduce it to simple terms, like he made everything so much worse for this timeline. And the chilling thing too, that I don't think about when I'm reading, is that timeline is going to exist for the people in that timeline. Like, he created a timeline that he doomed to this really terrible future, you know? And it's just like, I love that that the lesson for that is some things are just meant to be the way they're meant to be, you know? And you can try to control it, but a lot of times when you try to stick your thumb on the scale, you just make things worse, you know? And just kind of to trust, you know?
Yeah, and I haven't read too many of these, but it's kind of like when Marvel does their What If comics, and you get to explore this sort of alternate timeline. And even though it takes a while for us to get to 11/22/63 and the aftermath, I think King does a nice job of being like, hey, this is how things would have gone had Kennedy
Right.
stayed alive. And it's so grim. And with Kennedy being such a big personality and this massive figure in pop culture after his death, it leaves you wondering, well, what actually would have happened if he hadn't died that day?
Right. Well, and it's that argument about like killing Hitler, you know?
Yeah.
Like you're trying to make these changes in the world, but who are we to decide what is the right change to make, you know?
Yeah, so we have Jake going back to 1958 to kind of reset everything, and he lingers there for a while, which I like because this
I
is
do
something
too.
that is very hard for Jake. In his timeline where he changed things, he lost Sadie, and he lost her in a terrible way. You know, he lost her because he fell over and she's the one who got shot instead of him.
Yeah, and it's like that he has to struggle with the fact that the future knowledge or the power that he thought he had wasn't enough to protect her, you know, and it wasn't enough to protect everyone else, and that he does not have the control he thought he had, you know, which I think when I look at Stephen King's like worldview on religion and God, I think that kind of plays into like just kind of accepting the things that we don't understand, you know, and that it's really hard to do that, you know, like we just read Desperation on the Losers Club and Regulators too. But I think there's a lot of that struggling with like, how can I let go of this control that I feel like I need in order to feel safe, you know, or to protect to the people I love to feel safe, you know, and I love that he understands that he does not have that control, so he doesn't go get Sadie, you know, because I mean, he could just go live with Sadie for the rest of their lives and just live in the past. And I think that's what he really wants to do. But I think he understands, he's wise enough to see the bigger picture that, I don't know if I want to say selfish, but that's the myopic view, you know, that's just thinking about him and what would make him happy rather than everyone else in the world, you know.
I think what helps him make that ultimate decision to go back and close the portal is that he'll always have those memories, even though Sadie won't. It's something that is going to live with him forever. And then he, you know, looks her up and she's 80 years old and she doesn't remember him, but she knows there's something about him that just seems so familiar. And, you know, she's struggling to put her thumb on it, and they have this nice dance, and it's one of King's not necessarily happier endings, but you have this sense of accomplishment by the time it's done for Jake in particular.
Yeah, and it's bittersweet, you know, and that's like I mean, this time I cried like 8 times, but that's the third time that I always cry because it's just so sad. And like to think about all the time that they lost, you know, but that they still have that. Like he does have those memories. And I feel like Sadie had a full life too, you know, and I don't know if you saw The Haunting of Bly Manor.
Yes.
There's and I don't want to spoil any of that, but like there's an element of that of like, we can't be together forever because of events that I'm not going to spoil, but we will always have these moments and you can't take these moments away. And, you know, she talks about hearing his voice in her dreams and, you know, she'll always have that, you know, and it's really beautiful. And that's kind of what I was saying about like the times that you have, like those are the times that you savor. And the term making memories has always kind of bugged me because I think like if you're so busy trying to quote unquote make memories, you're not concentrating on the moment as you're experiencing it. But I love that I think the lesson I walk away from this book with is like, enjoy the time you have, you know, and really make the moments count and really kind of spend time with the people you love. You know?
Absolutely. Well, Jen, any final thoughts? I like to wrap up with ratings here. So before we get into that, any last minute things here?
Just love this book so much. It's fantastic. It's in my top 5 of all books ever, and I'll probably read it 5 more times, you know. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I had recently posted on like TikTok my top 5 King books, and I was like, I'm gonna have to rethink this as soon as I read 11/22/63, probably, because I had heard so many good things about it that I was like, okay, the people I'm hearing good things from, I trust their judgment, and I will probably like this. So for me, easy 5 out of 5.
Yeah, 5 out of 5 for me too. And I did have to rethink my top 10 or my top 5 after I read this book and popped it in there. 'Cause it's like, it's so good. It just feels so good to read too,
And it's so different from something like It or Pet Sematary or, Salem's Lot, where you have vampires and scary clowns and crazy pets coming back from the dead.
Yeah. Yeah. This book really is about people trying to do good things.
Yeah.
And that's just so comforting to read,
Absolutely.
This is a great audiobook, I will say, for if you get real stressed out. Like, this is a good one. It's a good comfort read too.
Yeah, I am putting off rereading anything until after I get through all of the books first for this podcast, because I read the edited version of The Stand.
Oh, wow. The original published version?
Yeah, because that's what my mom had. She had been buying the King books as they came out in mass market paperback. So that was the version when that came out. And I found a copy of the uncut edition, and I was like, well, I'll get around to this eventually.
So you haven't read the uncut yet?
No.
Ooh, I love it. But yeah, I read the original version first because that's what my dad had. You know? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are people that prefer the cut version, but I prefer the unabridged, I guess.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
I'm excited for you to get to read that for the first time. That's so fun.
Same. Maybe it'll be like another episode of the podcast down the line, and I can see if I even remember the edited version by then.
Right, yeah.
But Jen, thank you so much for joining me to talk about 11/22/63 today. It has been a blast.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun and one of my favorite books. So love talking about this. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And there will be links to the Losers Club and Psychoanalysis in the show notes. I'll link to your Twitter and everything too. So listeners, go check out Jen and her work.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Cemetery. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Cemetery sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Cemetery on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.